Rising temperatures continue to batter the Southwest as the National Weather Service now warns an extremely dangerous heat wave will soon begin to spread eastward. Phoenix is reportedly on track to reach their hottest week ever recorded. Earlier this week, the city experienced its 13th consecutive day with highs of 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Naturally, the extreme heat sparked debate over global warming and climate change on Twitter. Representative Ilhan Omar was hit with a community note when she tweeted a claim that the Earth broke the record for the hottest day in 120,000 years. Apparently, that data comes from unofficial observation records.
Meanwhile, not everyone is sounding the alarm on the climate crisis. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. tweeted that climate change is being used to control us through fear. Freedom and free markets are a much better way to stop pollution. Polluters make themselves rich by making the public pay for the damage they do. You show me a polluter, I'll show you a fat cat using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market. It sounds like he's been hanging out with some people of my ideological bent.
You know what's... Okay, I want to get into that, but just really quick, because I think that's going to take up the rest of the conversation. I do think that people are being blasé about what it means to have consecutive days of triple-digit heat, especially wet bulb temperatures. The Southwest right now, it's a very dry place where people can survive higher heat numbers than when you're in humid parts of the country and the heat gets to that level, because your ability to evapotranspirate and cool yourself off basically goes to nil once it's so wet and humid in the air. And in parts of the world where this has happened and is increasingly happening with regularity, and they don't have the infrastructure to support regular air conditioning areas in people's homes or in public structures, you have mass deaths just because the temperatures go up. And are we going to start to experience that more in the United States as our infrastructure fails? We have these brownouts. We have problems with having an electric grid that can support as much air conditioning use as going to be needed by people. I have friends who live in Utah who get concerned about their parents every time it gets very hot because they know it's fine, it's comfortable, unless the AC goes off, in which case the older people especially are going to cook in no time flat. You can't take your dog out between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. You just got to wait till the early morning or late at night because it is not survivable temperatures. And is that going to make people finally engage more substantively with the conversation about global warming?
Well, sure. And, we should do whatever, we should pursue policies that are going to make people who are in extremely hot parts of the world, who don't have access to air conditioning or shelter, all those things, what policies are going to help them have the same kinds of protection we do. I think that more people die in extreme cold than extreme heat.
Well, it's both, and not parts of the world. Right here in the United States of America, the Texas electric grid failure had people dying just a couple of years ago. Remember, Ted Cruz got in so much trouble for going on vacation when all of that was happening. So I do think it's a big issue. Now, pivoting to the RFK Jr. part of it, he got a lot of flack from the left by seeming to poo-poo the idea or to kind of dismiss the idea of global warming as a fear tactic, instead focusing on forcing polluting companies to internalize the cost of their pollution as a way to address the issue. Now, I don't understand why he has to poo-poo the idea of climate change. But I confess, unlike some of my peers on the left, intrigued by the approach of wanting to force companies to actually pay for the costs of the pollutants that they're putting in the environment. Because that is, frankly, what's going on here, is that to the extent that you believe that markets they make sense and that they're fair and that they're equitable, pollution is obviously an area where nobody can make that case. Where because it's so difficult to hold companies responsible, to track pollution, to track what the environmental harms actually are, not to mention the harms to individuals who are, we talked about the Kalamazoo paper factory and the way that all those babies are dying from the pollutants of that paper factory. But in the court of law, it can be very difficult to prove that one person got cancer because they were exposed to a toxic element, or whether they just got cancer because many people succumb to cancer. The causation is very difficult. When you're talking about these mass polluters, what is the dollar amount you're going to put on a polluter when the shore level rise 30 miles away is impacting somebody's beachfront property, or a farmer in the Midwest is not able to have the same crop yield because they're experiencing drought. I mean, how are you going to be able to prove causation there? And him saying we need to make more of an effort to make these polluting companies, it's like a handful of companies that are responsible for 70% of all of carbon emissions, is a better way to go about bringing down their emissions. I mean, that is interesting to me.
And that's not contrary to markets necessarily. I mean, from a purely philosophical standpoint, the idea of markets is property rights and decision rights over those property. A lot of environmental issues are what's tragedy of the commons, where the property rights are not well defined. It's no one specific private individual entity owns this space, and so you can cause. You're causing harm to it, and you're not accountable to it. Whereas, if I trespass on your property or I harm your property, I can be sued or whatever the criminal or liability is. I have to make you whole. But if it's this space where anyone can hunt or fish or pollute or there's no decision rights over the space, you have a worse outcome. So again, you don't have to call it free market if you don't like that phrase, but more understanding that more liability for damaging an area that no one specific entity has control over is fine and not incompatible with a free market.
Yeah, I mean, part of the issue is if our understanding of markets and market efficiency and accountability is only limited to property rights. That's how you get a situation where no one owns the sky, no one owns the air, no one owns the sea, and so people have been able to treat it with impunity. So I would argue that the result, we shouldn't just carve up sky rights and say that you get to own this 1 cubic meter of sky.
For sure, we should carve them up. Carve them up.
We need to reinterrogate why it is that we've based our accountability structure purely by giving people with property rights the right to enforce those claims instead of our broader global community who's suffering from this, of being able to enforce the rights against these polluters. It's 100 companies that are responsible for 71% of global emissions. And RFK Jr.'s point also about how those same companies are benefiting from public largesse in the form of subsidies from the government is, I think, an interesting tack to take especially if you believe that there's not the same political appetite for dealing with global warming as a more broad phenomenon. But America's top climate envoy, John Kerry, made the trip to China over the weekend to restart momentum on the country's joint climate change mitigation efforts. Kerry has faced criticism from the right for his extensive private air travel habit. The former Secretary of State hit out against his critics while testifying on the Hill late last week. Let's watch that.
Persistent lies that I hear, which is this private jet. We don't own a private jet. I don't own a private jet. I personally have never owned a private jet. And obviously, it's pretty stupid to talk about coming in a private jet from the State Department up here. Honestly, if that's where you want to go there.
Now, Minnie pointed out that his family owns a private jet and that he's splitting hairs.
Yeah, a lot of righteous indignation for someone who does in fact fly regularly on a private jet owned by his family.
Yeah.
So.
Look, I do think that there are some narrow, very, very narrow justifications for probably using a private jet that probably are not the scenario here when you're, this doesn't seem like to be some kind of emergency conference. I know that, there was an effort to not have any kind of private flight travel in the context of the Bernie campaign, precisely because you don't want this kind of pushback. But when you have rapidly packed campaign events flying from discrete parts of the country to another that don't have major hubs the way that you do on a campaign, sometimes it's unavoidable. Like, I'm open to the idea that occasionally that happens. Do you have to medevac somebody? Like, sometimes emergencies exist. I'm not saying throw out the technology of private air travel, but it is very rich, literally and metaphorically, for him to be bristling so much at what is a legitimate complaint about his own hypocrisy.
Yeah. More rising after this.